Hello and welcome to our expert interview for the third module. Today we're honored to have with us maybe a linguist who needs no introduction, Professor Noam Chomsky. Thanks for scheduling us in.
Glad to talk to you.
So we'll just start right away if that's okay?
Sure thing.
Of course.
Yeah.
So first of all, and I'm sure that you've answered this question many times before, but I think it's something that really interests the participants of this course, which is the reason that you got into linguistics in the first place.
The real reasons?
Well,
I was a 16-year-old undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had gone to the university with great expectations. The catalog looked really exciting. High school had been very boring, but this looked like a way out. But practically every course I took was just more of boring high school material, and I lost interest. There was one course I was quite interested in, Arabic, with a fine professor, a fine scholar, Italian anti-fascist emigre. This was 1945. Giorgio Levi della Vita. But I was practically ready to drop out of college. I was so bored with it. When I happened to meet Zelig Harris through separate connections, common political interests, and he was a very impressive person. I enjoyed talking to him. He suggested to me that I proofread his a draft, the book of his that was coming out. This came out later as Methods in Structural Linguistics. Yeah. It was my introduction to the field. And he suggested that I start taking his graduate courses, which I did. And then he suggested other graduate courses with other faculty members. I studied philosophy, mathematics, and started doing that. And ended up with a very weird undergraduate education, which consisted of a scattering of graduate courses. And, no professional credentials, but I just got more and more interested in the field. There was some background involved. My father was a Hebrew scholar, and his doctoral dissertation had been on Chomsky, medieval Hebrew grammarian, and when I was maybe 12 or 13, I read his doctoral dissertation and some work on history of Semitic. I was interested in that, and all of that fed into these common interests. Yeah.
So it all just came together at some point.
It just felt professional credentials in linguistics or any other field. I would never be admitted to any respectable department.
Okay, so well, you've been studying linguistics all of your life, I think, and what is it about language that you think is so fascinating that you've kept on studying it?
Well, language has been recognized for centuries by philosophers, by scientists, Descartes, Darwin, long list, as the essential, unique human endowment, the striking faculty that distinguishes humans from other organisms. That's a traditional view, and I think there's considerable evidence for it. And it is a kind of the human essence in a way. It's the source of our creativity, our originality, our ability to think and plan in ways that are unique in the animal world. And it also has some very strange properties when you look at it carefully. So language is what's called a digitally infinite system. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's infinite. There's no limit to the number of expressions that you can produce and understand, which is already interesting because how do you gain an infinite capacity from finite data? Yeah. And it's also digital. It's not continuous. Like, say, the communication system of bees is a continuous system. The language is a digital system. It's 5-word sentences, 6-word sentences, but no 5.5-word sentences. And digital infinity is an interesting property. It's by the mid-20th century, it had become quite well understood in the theory of computation, the mathematical theory of computation, and so on. And it became possible then, really for the first time, to try to capture accurately what the nature of this property is. And there are many interesting questions. It's quite unusual in the biological world. You don't find such systems. And traditionally it had been pretty hard to study because the concept of digital infinity, computability, was not really clearly understood theoretically until pretty much early mid-20th century within mathematics. And then it was.
So, so would I be correct in summarizing when I say that it's both the mathematical elements of the system and the way in which, by studying language, you can study the way that we are,
the essence,
like the essence of humanity.
Kind of creature we are. This is the kind we are. Not the whole story, but it's at the core. And so that combination of accessibility to formal inquiry, careful formal inquiry, and human significance is, I found, a kind of an irresistible combination.
Yeah, well, we of course wholeheartedly agree as budding linguists.
Yeah, another question we have is, what is the most surprising thing that you know now, but that you didn't know when you started doing linguistics?
Well, at the very beginning, first of all, I should say in connection with what you said before, that this is not the way language was looked at that time.
Yeah.
In fact, the general view of language was that languages can vary arbitrarily. Each one's different from every other one. You shouldn't approach any particular one with any preconceptions. And that language, a good illustration of how language was conceived was actually Harris's book, Methods in Structural Linguistics. It was a collection of procedures that a linguist can use in the field to organize the materials that he collects from an informant. That's what linguistics was. There was nothing much to say theoretically, maybe some things about the structure of phonology, of which kind of features there are, but beyond that, not very much. And that was because of the inability at the time, it's not really criticism, to capture what a generative procedure is, what is an infinite generative procedure. But it was pretty clear at the very beginning, say around 1950, that whatever, that each language has a kind of a basic property which ought to be common to all languages. That is a generative procedure which yields an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which has a determinate fixed interpretation at the interface with two other biological systems, the sensory motor system for externalization and the internal conceptual planning thought systems, sometimes called the conceptual intentional system. So there's these two external conditions that the generative procedure must satisfy, and this system had to evolve somehow. There was a time when it wasn't there. Now it's there. It's apparently uniform among humans. There's no known differences in linguistic capacity in the human species. So, for example, if you take someone from an Amazonian tribe which hasn't had contact with other humans for 20,000 years and bring them up in, say, Boston, they'll be like my grandchildren, and conversely, there's no known linguistic or other cognitive differences. So somehow something arose which is fixed, and it seems to be pretty recent. We didn't know that at the time, but by now it's pretty clear, that reasonably clear, that it hasn't evolved for at least 50 or 60,000 years since humans left Africa, and that if you go back not long before that in evolutionary time, there's no evidence that it existed. This was not now anachronistic. What I'm saying is now reasonably well known. It was then not known. What was known was that it somehow evolved, and that it seems to be the same for all people. Now that raises a very serious question. It suggests that when you try to write a linguistic a grammar of a particular language, it looks extremely complex. And each one looks very different from the last one you tried. And therefore the mechanisms that you have to propose for this basic principle appear to be extremely complicated. If you look at early generative grammars, 1950s, 1960s, the theoretical framework allowed for very complex operations and interactions of operations. And that seemed to be necessary for just descriptive adequacy, to try to capture the data. But it was obvious that couldn't be correct. For one thing, there's no way in which they could have been learned. And for another reason, it couldn't have evolved, the system of this complexity. So the right answer somehow has to be that there's an extremely simple system which somehow yields this diversity and complexity just through the interaction of extremely simple principles and general laws of nature, which are probably laws of computation. But that looked like an idle dream at the time. The most interesting discovery is that it may not be an idle dream. There's some reason today, I think, to take seriously a thesis which can't prove, but I think we're kind of approaching, that language is an almost perfect system. Meaning a perfect system would be one that satisfies universal non-linguistic conditions of computational efficiency. These are essentially laws of nature, and uses the simplest possible generative operation, combinatorial operation. We know what that is. And then, by the way, just the way it works yields the apparent diversity and complexity of languages through small modifications here and there. That's sometimes called the strong minimalist thesis. And it would have looked crazy 20 years ago, hopelessly impossible 50 years ago, now more or less plausible.
So what you're saying is that actually it's all surprisingly simple, or it's surprisingly orderly, maybe.
It's a possible thesis, which maybe your generation will prove, is that language is close to a perfect system. It's close to at its core, it's close to the optimal way of satisfying the interface conditions. There's more. By now, I think I'm not speaking of a consensus in the field by any means, just giving my personal opinion, a few other people. I think by now there's mounting evidence that the relation to the interfaces is asymmetric. That is, that in particular, the relation to the sensory motor system to externalization is ancillary. It's a secondary property. The core system of syntax and semantics and thought and so on is independent of the properties of externalization. So in particular, for example, it's independent of linear order of words. We have to speak. The words have to come out in linear order.
Yeah.
But I think that's just a property of the articulatory system. It doesn't have anything to do with the language. It's a filter through which language has to pass. And in fact, if you look at other systems of externalization, like sign, we now know, it wasn't known 40, 50 years ago, but it's now known that sign is essentially the same as spoken language. It has remarkably similar properties. But the externalization is different because it's a different modality. So you can use simultaneity in sign or spatial orientation in ways that you, say for an anaphora, for reference and so on, that you can't use in linear spoken language. And if you had other modalities, different conditions. But if this is correct, and I think there's good reason to believe it is, then virtually all of actual linguistic work is on a peripheral system. It's on the system of externalization. And that makes practical sense. So, for example, if somebody wants to learn, say, Dutch, they don't have to learn, they can't learn the fundamental principles. First of all, nobody knows them to teach them. What you learn is pronunciation, vocabulary, some facts about word order, things like that, which seem to be extremely superficial.
Yeah.
Very complicated, but extremely superficial. And apparently don't yield consequences for the core syntax and semantics, which is independent of them. And so, for example, say the relation between a verb and an object, transitive verb and an object, is the same semantically whether the verb precedes or follows the object. Doesn't care, and that seems to generalize quite widely to some interesting properties of language. So, if this is correct, and I suspect it is, then the core principle, the basic principle that I mentioned at the beginning, generating an infinite array of hierarchic structures mapping to the interfaces, should really be mapping to one interface, the thought.
Yeah, the conceptual
interface. Then there's another system which has to do with externalization, putting in public what's going on internal to your mind, which you're probably mostly unconscious of. And there's another possibility, I think, which looks to me increasingly plausible, is that much of the mental operations that are going on when you interpret, understand, create, produce expressions is not only unconscious but beyond the level of consciousness.
Yeah, but actually this sort of ties in with another question we had, because you're currently also involved in biolinguistics, and well, what is the focus of that field, we would like to know, and could you maybe explain something about it, about biolinguistics?
Well, this again goes back about 65 years, around 1950, when this kind of work began. There were a few, there was a kind of a party line, if you like, a broadly accepted consensus in the field. It was essentially behavioral science. You study behavior, organization of behavior in linguistics. You study the arrangement and organization and the patterns of data that you pick up and things, language acquired by training, by habit, by this evolution wasn't, maybe natural selection somehow, but nothing to say. But there were a few of us who had a different view, actually 3 graduate students. One of them's in the adjacent office, Morris Alley. Another is Eric Lenneberg, who went on to found biology of language. The 3 of us were graduate students at Harvard around early 50s, and we just disagreed sharply with the consensus view. Part of the disagreement was the recognition of what seems to me a truism, but is widely contested, and that is that language, your language, is an internal property of you. It's something inside you. It's not in the world. It's inside your brain, represented somehow. It's nowadays sometimes called an I language, internal language.
Yeah.
If language is an internal property of a person, then it's a biological system. And you ask yourself, what kind of a biological system is it? That's biolinguistics. And at that time there wasn't a lot to say about it, but over the years it's become a richer topic. Eric Lenneberg's book, Foundations of Biology of Language or something like that, came out in 1967. And in many ways it's still unsurpassed. I think he has the best discussion of evolution of language that one of the best that still exists. And but all of these topics were kind of thought about, but there wasn't much to say about them. So they say evolution of language. These are topics that were discussed right away. You had to recognize that somehow the system evolved, and it has to be simple enough so that it could have evolved. It's a condition, kind of overarching condition on construction of linguistic theories, and it showed that every one of them has just got to be wrong, because they're much too complex to have possibly evolved. That's actually the motivation for searching for something like what I called the strong minimalist thesis. It could have evolved, at least question how, but at least it's possible. But there wasn't much literature about it. There were lots of meetings, conferences, symposia, courses. I taught joint courses with a Nobel laureate in biology, Salva Luria, at MIT for years, but very little came out because there wasn't much to say. Linguistic theories were too complex for a sensible approach either to acquisition or to evolvability. The 1980s, 1990s, that began to change. There were things you could say. One change that was significant was around 1980 when the what's called the principles and parameters approach crystallized. That actually opened up lots of possibilities. The earlier approach to linguistic theory within this general framework was that linguistic theory provided a kind of a format for grammars. Each grammar of each particular language had to fit that format, and you picked the grammar on the basis of some evaluation measure given data. So the idea is a child has data, there's a fixed format in its head, which is genetically determined, and that it picks the simplest grammar in terms of a fixed technique of measurement given the data. That does, in principle, yield an answer to how language can be acquired, but it doesn't work because it requires astronomical calculations. So it's totally unfeasible. This was understood. It's in principle possible, but can't be right. The principles and parameters approach, which was pretty much crystallized in the early 80s, offered a different way of looking at it. The principles are fixed. They're part of the genetic endowment, and we hope to make them simple enough so that they could have evolved. That's what became called the minimalist program, but it's just a continuation of the effort since the early 50s, heading, hopefully, to the strong minimalist thesis or something like it as the answer to be reached. The parameters are the options available to the child to fix given data. And there's quite interesting work on parameter setting and the choices and arrangements of parameters and so on. There is, incidentally, an interesting evolutionary problem on the side where the parameters come from. And there are some interesting ideas about that. One possibility which is being explored is that there really aren't any parameters. It's just that the principles are underspecified in certain respects. And specification of what is underspecified gives the various options. If that turns out to be true, it'll solve the evolvability problem. But this is really hard work. You have to try to show in detail that the striking, the superficial diversity and complexity that you see is actually misleading, and that it's reducible to some fundamental, simple principles. This is pretty familiar in the sciences. I mean, to any science you look at, the data just looks hopelessly complex. In physics, say, that was true when Galileo and his associates tried to find simple principles of motion, they were pretty much ridiculed because it's obvious it's hopelessly complex. Just look at the leaves blowing in the wind and so on and so forth. And it took a long time for the understanding to be reached that you can account for diverse and complex phenomena in terms of simple principles if you can discover what they are and how they function. Same in biology. In fact, at the time when it was generally assumed in linguistics that languages are arbitrarily different from one another and no limit on diversity, and pretty much the same was assumed about biological organisms, that the diversity and complexity of organisms was so great that each one had to be studied on its own. Over the years, it's been found that that's not true, that there's striking uniformities, conservation of fundamental forms, limited possibilities for organisms, and something. In fact, it's gotten so far that there's even a proposal which is taken seriously, though not accepted, that there's a universal genome, one genome for everything, and just minor variations on it. That's not an outlandish proposal by now. It's just like the strong minimalist thesis.
So I'm afraid I suppose that we're running out of time soon, and I'm sure that you have many other obligations today. So just as to wrap it up, of course, there's people watching this video who are already interested in linguistics. They're taking this introductory online course. So after this course, they will know a little bit about linguistics. What would you recommend for them? Should they read your oeuvre, or is that maybe one step too far at this point?
Everything I've been saying is a minority opinion. I'm not giving a consensus in the field, and that should be understood.
Yeah.
All my life, in fact, I've been part of a small minority of linguists, kind of against the stream. So that has to be taken into account.
Yeah.
It's the way it looks to me. It's not the way it looks to the field. But that's for, students have to figure that out for themselves.
Yeah.
There's a diversity of opinion, which are the right ways to think about these things.
But that's a good thing, I suppose, right? I mean, sorry to interrupt. That's a good thing. I mean,
I think
differences of opinion lead to interesting new...
Exactly. That's what makes a field exciting.
Yeah.
And this one is a very exciting one, both because of the significance of the study of language, as we talked, it's kind of core of human nature.
Yeah.
The apparent conflict, and I think it's apparent, between the diversity and complexity of the data and the recognition that there's got to be a core, fundamental, simple explanation for it because of the conditions of learnability, evolvability, and so on. And that kind of superficial contradiction makes an extremely interesting field.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, thanks very much.